You save $5 million for retirement, maybe even more, and on paper, that should feel like total financial freedom. But what I've seen over and over is that once people reach that level, a different kind of challenge begins. Because while money eliminates a lot of stress, it also opens doors to new decisions, new uncertainties, and a whole lot of internal pressure to get it right. So today we're walking through a case study of John and Mary, and I'll show you the parts of retirement planning that look the same no matter how much you saved, and the parts that most people don't expect until they're already living it. So whether you're already at this level or just working towards it, this is what $5 million really gives you and what it doesn't fix. Now, of course, I've changed their names for privacy and I've rounded the numbers for simplicity, but John and Mary are a couple in their early 60s. John has had a tremendous run at his company. He joined over 20 years ago and has been through the company through ups and downs. And then Lisa worked at a nonprofit for many years and decided to step away from the workforce about 3 years ago. And they're here in California. Now, John and Lisa have a net worth a little under $7 million if you include their home, but like many people in this decision, they had big questions on what the next 30 years of finances are going to look like. And we're going to walk through what those plans were. And most of the clients we work with fall in the $1 to $5 million range, but we're also seeing more families in the $6 to $10 million range. And what's interesting is what I hear from them is that life doesn't feel unlimited at that level. Yes, it opens a lot of doors, but only if it's managed with intention. And that's exactly where John and Mary were when they came to us. And this is a critical part of planning, and that is understanding clearly what you're trying to do, what are you trying to accomplish. And for them, first it was to build a sustainable retirement income plan, factoring in taxes, longevity, and flexibility. And then secondly, to create a structured investment strategy. Most of our money was sitting in pre-tax retirement accounts and the rest in a brokerage account. And then thirdly, they want to enjoy their time, travel, spend time with family, and be more present. And then fourth, they had a growing interest in charitable giving and wondering if they could increase their impact now and what that might look like in retirement. And while $5 million is certainly well above average, most of the people we work with in that range surprisingly don't see themselves as wealthy. They're not flying private or shopping for yachts. They're usually people who worked incredibly hard over decades and built their wealth the slow and steady way through discipline, through ownership, through sacrifice. In fact, many of them are still frugal at heart. They may spend a little bit more than they used to, but it's usually to buy quality, not luxury. Higher quality appliances, a more reliable car, fewer repairs, fewer headaches. But even with $5 million, the transition to retirement isn't easy, and that could be similar across the board, no matter how big your portfolio. And they had concerns that we're very familiar with most retirees that get to this point. Will they have enough income to accomplish some of the big goals I have for the rest of my life, especially considering things like healthcare costs? Are we overpaying in taxes? Like for them, they have a significant amount in pre-tax balances. They were worried about required minimum distributions, which we'll talk about in this video. And are we making the right decisions, or could we be unknowingly making costly mistakes? And then finally, how do we adjust to this new lifestyle? Now, they were no longer going to be working. Their routines, their identity, their sense of purpose were shifting. And I find that that kind of transition can create a little bit more uncertainty than most people expect. So let's take a look at where they stood financially. Now, the largest part of their portfolio came from decades of saving in his 401k and her 403b. They have roughly a little over $4.2 million in that pre-tax balance, and the rest in a tax approach account. And this was a result of investing for decades, getting employer contributions into a 401k. And on top of that, your employer stock that just did really well for you. They still have a mortgage, but it's a low rate fixed loan at about 3% and will be paid off in about 7 years. And because of that low rate, they weren't really in a hurry to accelerate any sort of payments. So what do? They have $5 million in investments. They have no paycheck in the next 30 years ahead of them. This is where the planning work really begins, not just with the spreadsheets and asset allocation, but with clarity, confidence, and a strategy that really matches your life, not something that's cookie cutter. So let's walk through exactly how we built the plan and how to address a lot of their questions that just having a dollar amount like $5 million alone couldn't necessarily fix. Now, you might think the question might be, how do we spend all this? For people like John and Mary, the real question is, how do we give ourselves permission to spend without second guessing everything? And we ran the numbers, what they could spend versus what they are actually spending. And we noticed there was a noticeable gap, not because of affordability, but because of habit, because of how they lived for decades, because they were planners, savers, and problem solvers. And that doesn't just switch off overnight. So how do we bridge the gap to start spending what you've worked so hard for? And how do we tie the wealth back to the life you actually want to live? Let's jump right into the income plan and specifically how to determine what they can comfortably spend. Now, John and Mary estimate they need about $14,500 per month to keep giving, pay for health insurance, and enjoy life as usual. But as we dug in the numbers, we recommend a budget closer to $16,500 of what maybe they're more likely to spend. Now, here's why there's a difference. First, in our experience, most people tend to underestimate their spending. This is especially true when coming from a career where maybe your employer paid for a lot of your travel, paid for expenses, and you're sort of in a routine. And secondly, travel was high on the priority list, and they felt like they could do within their original budget, maybe spend an additional $10,000 per year. But we noticed that might be a little bit on the lower side when we talked about where they actually want to go. So we specifically allocated about $25,000 extra per year for those travel expenses. Now, the good news is even with the additional budget for travel, they still had a very meaningful surplus of over $70,000 per year above their core expenses. Now, they don't have to spend that money. They could simply let it reinvest in the portfolio, but that surplus immediately reassured them, and it told us that they had more than enough to comfortably support their lifestyle, and having that surplus can help with factoring in any sort of unforeseen costs like future healthcare expenses, which is one of their big concerns. And another lever for doing that is putting a floor in their plan. For example, putting $800,000 adjusted for inflation earmarked for the end of their plan for any sort of long-term care needs. What this does for spending is sort of adds a false floor to their spending where things never go to zero. It's similar to a fighter pilot. They never use the real ground.
Altitude. Your strategy is about to run us into the ground. What's your move? Altitude.
They use a false floor or an altitude of 5,000 feet because the consequences are too grave to use real ground. But even though John and Mary aren't currently spending their entire planned allowance, their income plan is designed to adjust dynamically based on their portfolio performance. Now, if their investments continue to grow, the guardrails will alert us to say, hey, you can probably spend more here. Your withdrawal rate's too low right now, you deserve a raise. But life inevitably may have curveballs. On the other hand, if the portfolio were to experience a significant downturn, say dropping below $3 million, the plan clearly signals a need to temporarily tighten spending. This means John and Mary never have to take a guess when they should cut back and when they can confidently spend more from their portfolio. Their plan clearly shows them exactly when adjustments make sense, taking the guesswork and a lot of the anxiety out of their retirement plan. John and Mary have been flexible their whole life with spending, so they love the idea that their plan will tell them if they need to reduce rather than having to guess if we go into a bear market. But let's take the next step and focus on taxes. Why taxes? Because a good retirement strategy isn't just about income and investments, but also minimizing unnecessary taxes. Because John and Mary have a good mix between pre-tax and taxable, and they're retiring early, this puts them in a unique beneficial position, something we call the tax valley. This means that early in retirement, their taxable income and therefore their tax rates will be quite low, which is a lot opposite to their working years, where they were in some of the highest tax brackets. But at retirement, for them, it's dropping into this valley. And here's a critical question we ask. Can we take advantage of these low tax years now, and can it significantly reduce their taxes over their lifetime? So let's see what happens when we project out their lifetime tax bill at their current withdrawals. If they simply drew mechanically from their brokerage accounts, then delaying drawing from their traditional IRAs, and finally any sort of Roth money, well, at current tax rates, they'd overpay lifetime taxes by roughly $1.6 million in today's dollars. Now, one of the strategies to help turn this scenario around is by strategically implementing a series of Roth conversions in these early years. This means carefully moving from some of their pre-tax money into tax-free accounts while intentionally balancing the conversions to fit their unique situation. But we need to pause for a section because you might be wondering, well, John and Mary, they do have a large brokerage account. Couldn't they just live off the taxable account indefinitely, pay minimal capital gains taxes and keep things simple, maybe even pay low health insurance costs and get subsidies? Well, the thing is, there's a lot of different trade-offs here. Once John and Mary turn 73, they'll need to be ready to take required distributions from their traditional IRAs, estimated to create much more income forced upon them than they actually need. And all that income is going to be fully taxable. therefore potentially increasing their tax rate a lot higher than what it is right now when they retire early. So by paying a little bit of tax now, where we can control the taxes, we can control how much income to take, it's sort of like tax insurance. Now, taxes aren't optional if you own an IRA or 401k, but finding the sweet spot for the right amount is essential, because converting too little, you may pay unnecessary tax later, but on the other hand, you can convert way too much and maybe pay too much in taxes now. But you can read all about Roth conversions online, but here's a critical part that moves beyond the hypothetical and into the real planning, and specifically how it relates to John and Mary. And John and Mary's priorities around spending and taxes were closely connected to their desire to give charitably. Now, since they're spending less than they actually could afford to, they want to know if they could afford to give more. And of course, the short answer is yes. In the early years, we can give appreciated stock to charity, but in future years, we can build a giving strategy that will leverage their IRAs once they turn age 70.5 using something called a qualified charitable distribution, otherwise known as QCDs. And here's how it works in practice. If their required minimum distribution is $100,000, but they send $50,000 directly from their IRA to the charity, only the remaining $50,000 counts as taxable income. That's a significant tax advantage, and another reason we wouldn't want to over-convert all their IRAs to Roth accounts, and a strategy they could take advantage of for decades in their retirement. Their other priority, of course, was legacy planning. John and Mary wanted to make sure they have enough for themselves, of course, but also have a goal of leaving a meaningful inheritance. This is another reason strategic Roth conversions made sense. Now, even if John and Mary never spend the Roth money themselves, those Roth dollars can grow tax-free for decades, ultimately passing to their kids as tax-free wealth. So I can hope you start to see all the different layers involved here: sustainable spending, tax planning, charitable planning, and creating a legacy are all things that help give John and Mary the confidence and ultimately know what's really possible. But none of the opportunities we've talked about, the spending flexibility, tax savings, family legacy, will work if the investments aren't thoughtfully managed. Now, John and Mary recognize something important. Markets and economies cycle through good times and bad times, so they really wanted a plan to help weather through both. When we first met, their investments consist mainly of 401k mutual funds with relatively high fees and not really much of a strategic direction. And one of their biggest questions was, how do I shift my investments now that I'm getting retirement, and how much risk should we take on in terms of owning things like stocks? Now, this chart from Retirement Researcher goes through the different withdrawal rates based on allocations, and you can see the yellow line is holding all cash and bonds versus the black line is 100% stocks. Now, typically, as you can see, they sort of converge, but usually you're rewarded for taking on risk, which means the more risk you take on, more likely the higher withdrawal rate you can sustain. And there's a couple different factors that go into positioning a portfolio retirement. Number one is risk tolerance. Now, John and Mary lost money in 2008, but they learned the importance of staying the course and of course saw their portfolios recover. I was just talking to somebody who did lose money in 2008 and they didn't wait for it to cover, and they know they just don't want to take quite as much risk on. This is the psychological part of investing. And of course, then there's risk capacity. If your expenses are covered by Social Security or a pension, you may have capacity to take on more risk because you're not withdrawing as much money. And finally, there's the risk requirement, which is someone who wants to spend more, of course, may need to take on more risk because their portfolio needs to grow for a lot longer time. But what was the ideal amount for them to take on in retirement? Well, if we take on too much risk, they may not be able to sleep well at night, and also subject their portfolio to sequence of returns risk, which can mean going back to work. And that is especially important in the first 5 to 10 years of your plan, which makes a huge difference. But on the other side, not enough risk means you can't keep up with inflation, and you most likely run out of money at the end of your life because your money just didn't grow enough. Now, here's where many people make the critical mistake. They approach retirement investing the same way they did during their working years, focusing mostly on age or just risk tolerance alone. While those factors are certainly important, transitioning from a saver to a spender ultimately changes everything, and it requires a much different approach. So what we did was revisit John and Mary's spending plan to determine how much they'd actually withdraw each year, and we see that retiring halfway through the year, their initial plan called $157,000 this year, then $274,000, then $283,000, $292,000, and then $294,000, all inflation adjusted for the next several years. Then we asked, okay, that's how much income they needed, but but how much do we want to set aside in those more stable assets like cash and bonds to ride out any potential market downturns if we did head into a bear market right when they retired. Now, bear markets historically average about 3 years from peak back to recovery, but some of the toughest downturns can last as much as 7 years. We want to ensure that John and Mary wouldn't be forced to sell stocks at a significant loss in the middle of a bear market. And by understanding their spending plan and their risk capacity, we can allocate the portfolio to have a cushion for these bear markets. For example, if John and Mary were to enter a bear market and stocks were down, we could see that in year one, we want to make sure we have very liquid short-term money available for them to spend so we don't have to sell from stocks. Now, none of these on my screen are investment recommendations, but this could be something like a money market that's very liquid and short-term to fund all of 2025. And then by the end of 2025, this next layer of conservative investments will mature to cover income for the next year. And then you can see that each year will be able to help them comfortably wait out the storm of withdrawals so they don't have to sell from their equities. For them, it was about 5 years of income in that bucket to ride out some of the worst market scenarios. That way we aren't concerned what happens to the other 74% of the portfolio, because that's for long term. That's so they can continue to spend more in retirement, and so that has enough time to recover. Now again, this is an investment recommendation for equities, of course, as well. I'm just using the market as more as a proxy for big picture, because you can own different types of bonds, different areas of the stock market like small cap, international. But when times are good for John and Mary and this equity portion grows, what we can do is just refill these buckets of conservative investments for the next bear market. And then you sort of repeat the cycle over and over again throughout retirement. You can choose your own trigger for when to trim some of the equity. We use a 20% relative band to trigger that adjustment for our clients. But overall, this means an overall allocation for them of about 75% stocks and 25% cash and bonds. Look, there's no cookie cutter way of doing this. It comes down to cash flow and your plan. But this type of strategy helped them plan for those scenarios that kept them up at night and gives them the confidence knowing that their investment plan matches their actual life. So retiring with $5 million or even $10 million certainly solves a lot. It gives you freedom, security, and options that maybe most people can dream about. But here's the truth that John and Mary's story reveals, and that is money alone doesn't automatically solve the deeper challenges of retirement. The uncertainty, the emotional adjustments, and the ongoing decisions around spending, taxes, and family. Here's what $5 million or more won't fix. It won't guarantee you'll feel comfortable spending your hard-earned savings. Sometimes frugal habits are deeply intertwined and hard to change. It won't fix the tax burden that you now have to manage, and certainly won't clarify your sense of purpose or identity once you step away from your career. This is why we believe that real retirement planning isn't just about growing a portfolio, it's about giving meaning to your money, structuring your spending, and having a purpose. And the good news is, as you've seen today, addressing these emotional and strategic aspects of retirement planning takes thoughtful attention and careful planning that you can now start on no matter how much money you have. But I barely scratched the surface on investing for an early retirement. If you want to learn more on how to allocate a portfolio to generate income for retirement, click the link below and I'll catch you guys over on the next one. Once again, this is Matt Calcagno with One Degree Advisory. If you'd like to talk to me or someone on my team about your plan to retire, click the link in the description below and we'd love to chat with you.